Hi, my name is Nicole, and welcome to another episode of Bible Backdrop. It's here that we are digging into the scriptures leading up to Easter Sunday. We're understanding these stories and looking at the political temperature, the historical context, the societal norms, all that influence these stories at hand. And today we are understanding the Last Supper. If you want to read it for yourself, I encourage you to in Matthew 26, verses 17 through 30, Mark 14, verses 12 through 26, Luke 22, verses 7 through 38, and John 13, verses 1 through 38. The story starts out with Jesus sending John and Peter to go find a man at the well to help him prepare the Passover meal for him and the disciples. And for us, we could go, what? He's just sending them to the well to go find a single man? But this man would have stood out. The reason is because only women would go to the well. And Jesus is sending them saying, look for a man carrying a water jug. And at this time, we have to understand that roles were clearly defined, and the place at the well was always a woman's job. So as they walked there and they saw this single man carrying the water jug, they went up to him, and he prepared the Passover for them. He had a house. A lot of times when we look at the way that the house structures were during this time, they would have upper rooms, and there would be a stairway going through the house to the upper room, but then there would usually be a stairway on the outside of the house going to the upper room. And this man, we'll just call him the Unnamed Servant, actually prepared the entire Passover for the disciples. And understanding that this was not a small task. This would be preparing the lamb, making the unleavened bread, all of the spices and the sauces that would go into. It's like making a Thanksgiving feast for an event you're not even going to be present at, a dinner you're not even invited to. Yet this unnamed servant prepared all of this for the disciples. I also love the idea that Passover was meant to be celebrated with families. And here Jesus is telling his disciples, you are my family. I want to spend Passover with you. And this is with Jesus knowing that Judas was going to betray him, Peter was going to deny him, Thomas was going to doubt him. But still he said, you guys are my tribe. You're my crew. And here, let's sit down and have this feast, this Passover together. You see, when we understand the seating of like what this looked like when you would sit down for the Passover, usually there would be a low table, like really close to the ground. And they would sit there, and the person of honor would sit in the middle, and it would kind of be like a U-shaped. But then they would lay on their right side and actually eat with their left hand as they would dip the bread into all of the spices. So although it seems very relaxed, it was actually very elegant for them. It was a formal seating to be sitting on the floor and laying on the floor, which seems a little weird for us, but here it was very customary. When we understand how John starts out the Last Supper, John 13:1 says this, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. I love how this opens up with the Last Supper. He loved his disciples on earth, and he loved them to the very end. And John starts out with the feet washing right when they get into that upper room for the Passover. Understanding that he is pulling his disciples and washing their feet. And for us, we're like, what did this really mean? Well, foot washing was something very customary at the time when you would first come into a place. But usually it was done by a servant. Why? Because you had the dusty roads as you're wearing the sandals. And it was a way to be ready, especially for a very nice dinner like Passover. And so a servant would come and sit you down at the front door and wash your feet. But here, Jesus sits down his disciples, and he is washing his disciples' feet. You know, I think it's interesting when we look into this because he washed every single disciple's feet. He even washed Judas's feet. And it was something, because it was a job of a slave, it was very humbling for his disciples to allow Jesus to wash his feet. That's why Peter himself, if you recall, he says in John verses 8-9, you will never wash my feet. And Jesus says, if I can't wash you, you can't be a part of me. You see, Jesus was talking more about washing feet. He was talking about cleansing them of all the sin in their life, of washing the impurities away from him, away from his disciples, but he's also talking to his disciples about submitting. You see, being humble to allow Jesus to wash their feet, although he was acting like a servant, it required humility from the disciples. And so he was requiring his disciples, be humble, allow me to serve you. And then Peter, when Jesus says, you can't be a part of me unless you allow me to wash your feet, Peter, still not quite getting it, says, then not only my feet, Lord, wash my hands, wash my head, wash every part of me. You see, that is a beautiful analogy, and that's the way we should be with Christ. But then as they sit down at the table and they're starting to eat, Jesus foretells his own betrayal. We dig into Matthew 26, verses 21 through 25, Mark 14, verses 18 through 21, John 13, verses 21 through 30, Luke 22, verses 21 through 30. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says, one of you here will betray me. And I think it's interesting that in both of those books, they all say, is it me, Lord? Is it me? And I look at that and I think they had no reason to suspect Judas when they were actually thinking it could be themselves before anybody else in the room. You see, there was a loyalty in this group, and even Judas himself was the treasure for the group, one of the most trusted people within their group. When we understand what's going on as Jesus foretells his own betrayal, there would be spices and sauces that would sit amongst the table. One of the sauces would be a fruit sauce that you would dip your bread in. And this sauce would be made out of dates and figs and nuts. And it was supposed to represent the brick and the mortar used with the Israelite nation before they were released from captivity in Egypt. And they would take their bread and they would dip it into this delicious sauce, something that they would make specially for Passover. And here Jesus says, the one who dipped his hand in the dish as me, saying that this is the one that's going to betray him. You see, we have to understand that Judas was sitting there with his hand in the same bowl as Jesus when he says this. So if we understand that, Jesus says, the one with his hand in the same bowl as me, we know that John was sitting beside Jesus. But who was sitting on the other side of Jesus? It had to be Judas. Whoever was sitting on the left and right of Jesus would be a place of honor. To be able to, it's like even today, right? The closer you sit to the host, the more it's a place of honor. Here, Jesus is the focal point of the Passover. And the two people on his right and his left are John and Judas. Judas is sitting in a place of honor. Another reason why they did not suspect him. I believe that it's as if Jesus was saying he knew that Judas had already started the negotiations to betray him. But it's as if he was sitting Judas there going, Judas, I still love you. Judas, it's okay. You're still my disciple. You're still one of me. As we understand in John 13:2, it says the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus even before they came into the Passover. His decision was already made. Perhaps the money was already taken from the chief priest in his pocket as he sat beside Jesus at the Passover. In John 13, verses 22 through 27, Peter leans over to John, so we understand Peter's on the other side of John, and he says, who is he talking about that's going to betray him? John then leans over to Jesus and said, Jesus, who is it? And Jesus said, it's the one I give this bread to. Again, Jesus giving the bread and handing it to Judas, and Judas taking the bread and eating it. Understanding that that was also a place of honor. For the host to feed the person beside him was an honor. Jesus again saying, Judas, I know what you're going to do, but I still love you. You see, then if we look, Luke actually switches the story about how they were arguing about who was the greatest. And perhaps this is why we've got Peter and we've got John who understand what Jesus is saying about Judas being the one to betray him. But how did the other disciples not catch on? As Jesus is saying, the one who's going to betray me has his hand in the same bowl. The one that's going to betray me is going to eat the bread I handed him. The other disciples didn't get it. And I think when we understand what Luke switches the story to, and that's that they were arguing about who was the greatest. It's as if they were saying, am I the betrayer? No, I'm not. Because aren't I something? Right? It's like that switch of like, am I the betrayer? Oh, you know what? No, I can't be because I'm one of the greatest. Wait, who's the greatest? And this just makes me giggle a little bit that on the other side of the table, they were more concerned about who was the greatest than who was going to betray Jesus. Perhaps it was their own insecurity because neither of them, that crew, was not sitting on his left or his right. Luke 22:26 says, Jesus hears this conversation and says, those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. Didn't I model this for you? It's as if he's saying, when you walked in the doors, didn't I model this for you as I washed your feet as a servant would? That truly is the greatest. And perhaps Peter was also in the discussion of who was the greatest, because he replies, I'm ready to go to prison with you and to die for you, Jesus. But then Jesus tells him that before the rooster crows, you will deny me. Peter had amazing, amazing faith in Jesus. But I believe his hope was starting to falter as the days would go on, as the moments would go on, and he would see what would go on. I don't think it was his faith that faltered that made him deny Jesus, but it was his hope in Jesus that faltered, that made him deny him. But we can definitely see a different outcome from the denial of Jesus to the denial of Peter to the betrayal of Judas. And we'll talk about that to come. You see, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus also will talk about the sacraments as he ends this Passover time with his disciples. And he will lift up the bread, Judas still in the presence here. He will lift up the bread and he will break it and he will say, this is my body broken for you. He will lift up the wine and he will tell his disciples, this is my blood that will be spilled out for you. He hands the cup around and every single one of the disciples drink from the cup, including Judas. He says in Matthew, this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people, poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many. And then he says, I will not drink wine with you until the day I drink it in my Father's kingdom with you. And I look at that and we have to understand, for Jesus to say, by the way, I'm not drinking this wine. And in fact, I'm not going to drink wine with you again until my Father's kingdom until we're together in my Father's kingdom. And understanding that this really meant something. Why? Because wine was something that was drank as much as water. Now, understanding wine at the time, it definitely had a lower alcohol content than it does today. And so it was something you could drink more of, more frequently, and it not having any effect on you. Also, we have to understand a lot of the water was contaminated. Wine, because it was fermented even a little bit, actually cleansed out some of those impurities. So it was actually safer to drink than a lot of the water that you could get from other places. And so that was at the time why wine was something that was drank on a continual basis. And here Jesus is saying, I'm not going to drink wine with you until we're together in my Father's kingdom, which had to make the disciples scratch their head and go, but we do this all the time. What do you mean there's not going to be another meal that we sit down together? See, when we understand Passover was all about finding the unblemished lamb. And here Jesus was breaking the bread and showing the blood of Jesus in that grape juice and that wine and saying, I am the Lamb of God. I love the idea that he used bread and wine. Why? Because they were some of the most common elements. Still today, thousands of years later, bread and wine are common elements. I love it because for thousands of years, it's something that everybody can attain. Everybody still drinks wine and eats bread. You see, it's as if Jesus was telling them, I'm going to give my life for you. This is the blood shed for my sins. You have a place at my table, always. My body broken for you, my blood spilled out for your sins. And still the disciples were going, what does he truly mean? But John 13:34 says this. Jesus says, I will be with you only a little while longer. You can't come yet where I am going. So now I am giving you a new commandment, to love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. I'm giving you a new commandment. Go love each other. Well, Jesus, that's not a new commandment. You've given us all these other commandments throughout these 3 years we've walked with you. Go love other people as you love yourself. This is the greatest commandment. But no, this is a new commandment. He says, love others the way I have loved you. You see, Jesus was getting ready to walk into a sacrificial love. He was ready to give his own body, his own life for these disciples sitting around this table, including Judas. He says, love others with a sacrificial love. We understand the powerful words that Jesus was speaking here. The disciples, still a little confused on the matter, they were unaware of what the next 24 hours would hold. But what we do know is when the Passover ended, Judas left. we look in the scriptures, and even John references still not quite getting what Jesus had said about Judas being the one to betray him. John says, I think he's leaving to go pay for the food, to go pay that unnamed servant for the food. Or perhaps Judas is just going to go take care of the poor. Maybe he knew somebody who needed a meal tonight. They still had the highest hopes for Judas, but Judas was leaving to go meet with the chief priests because Judas knew where Jesus was going next. And Judas knew he was going to be alone in a quiet spot. But that's a story for next time. So we hope you join us again here at the Bible Backdrop.